Hey everyone, welcome to a special Youth Specialties post-election Hangout on Air. My name is Jacob Eckeberger. I'm the content manager for YS, and I am fortunate enough to be in a virtual room with some incredible thought leaders from the world of youth ministry, and honestly to help us catch our breath from all that has happened in this election season. And our focus today is just on unity. How do we as youth workers lead the way in helping students and families bridge the divides in their communities? And before we dig into the conversation, I want to go around the virtual room and let everyone introduce themselves. And Stephanie, I'm hoping that you can start us off today.
Sure. Well, my name is Stephanie Caro. I am a lifelong youth worker, and right now then I am serving as senior consultant for Ministry Architects.
I am Cesar Castellanos. I am a church partner with Young Life and Hope Church in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Fred, why don't you tell us a little bit about you, man?
Yeah, I'm Fred Oduyoye. I am Director of Networking for YS, served as youth pastor in a few different churches, and then with Urban Youth Workers Institute, and as their Director of programming for their one-day training. And so now I'm here connecting people.
I'm Jeremy Del Rio in New York. I am a longtime youth minister based in the city, been a youth pastor, currently lead an organization called Thrive Collective that works in about 100 public schools around the city.
Hey everybody, I'm Brian Abbey. I'm Director of YS Search and YS Coaching. I'm out in Seattle.
Duffy, why don't you give us a little bit about you, man?
All right. Yeah, Duffy Robbins. I teach youth ministry at Eastern University in suburbs of Philadelphia. And I stayed up late watching the election, and I may doze off. Forgive me.
I'm Jenny Olson, and I've been involved in youth ministry for decades on a bunch of different levels. As a youth pastor in a church, I taught youth ministry at a university and a seminary, and worked with the denomination, and am now the acting director of Youth Specialties.
Hi, I'm Akila Lagande in Long Island, New York, not too far from Jeremy there. I'm currently serving in 3 different areas. So I'm a staff consultant with Ministry Architects, hey Stephanie, and racial field staff for racial ethnic young women for the Presbyterian Church USA, and also YAV site coordinator, so young adult volunteer site coordinator for young adults here in New York City.
Ash, can you say a little bit about you? I know you've got a sleeping 1-year-old near you.
Yes,
so.
I do. I'm Ash Sanfilippo. I work for an organization called Treehouse in Twin Cities, in Minneapolis. We work with at-risk kids, primarily unchurched, generally lower income kids in the suburbs of Minneapolis.
Awesome. Well, I would love to start the conversation in a place of peace because I feel like personally I need that desperately. And so Duffy, I hope you'll lead us out in this first question. How have you personally found peace in the midst of this election and all the craziness and staying up late last night and trying to catch up on that? How did you wake up this morning with peace?
Well, I guess there were several thoughts that came to me by way of Twitter yesterday, just different people that kind of captured, or in the last few days, I guess, sort of captured the sense of grief that I feel about our country, and also the sense of angst and confusion. I fully intended to vote, and I did. but sort of felt like this is going to be one where you just have to pinch your nose as tight as possible, because it's just going to be an odious responsibility. But these tweets, basically all of them sort of pointed back to the same idea, and namely the idea that that God is sovereign, and that in some ways I sort of feel like I was saying to one guy that it's sort of like we have the candidates we deserve. That's not a good thing. That we've created, that we're sort of creating our own exile. Like we don't have to go to Babylon like the people of Israel. We don't have to be exiled. We've kind of brought Babylon to us, and in the midst of that, where they felt completely forgotten by God, God still used exile in his story of Israel to bring them to a place ultimately of redemption, to be a part of his redemption story. And so I guess to me, that's the piece I keep coming to, that none of this catches God off guard, that God is sovereign. There were just, I don't know, just Scotty Smith, he's an old friend, and we kind of became Christians together, and or grew in the faith together in our early years as discipled by the same guy. And he had a couple of comments that really sort of impacted me about how that God's sovereignty was going to be the same no matter what happens yesterday. And of course I knew that, but just to be reminded of that, and my wife Maggie and I, we kept kind of talking back and forth about that and the implications of that. So that's, nothing novel, nothing, stunning, but just to remember that God is on the throne no matter who's in the White House.
A great reminder. Anyone else want to share about kind of their first interactions with people this morning, and where they're able to find peace in all of it?
Jacob, I've had a couple of texting from folks, fellow youth pastors, who said, I'm scared. And one of my texts back to a dear friend who said that, and I texted, I think for me, this may be one of the best things that has ever happened for my personal faith walk, because it's driving me even closer back to Jesus, because I don't have any other way to deal with all of this, and maybe God is going to work all of this together for our good. And that's kind of where I'm clinging today.
Jacob, for me, I have a 7-year-old son who woke up this morning bright and early, as he usually does, and he came in the living room and heard that President Trump had been elected. And he looked at me with this sincerity in his eyes and said, Dad, do you think the world is doomed? And then he came over and he sat in my lap, and as he did that, I looked at him and said, Cyrus, as long as there are people like you in the world, I don't believe it's doomed at all. You have too much compassion, too much creative energy, and your heart is too filled with love for me to lose hope in the future. And that, I think, very much reflects kind of where I'm coming at this. Our hope is not in politics. I'm convinced more than ever that God is neither a Democrat nor a Republican. He's not surprised by election results. Nothing that we're experiencing comes to him, is caught him off guard. And so our responsibility, I think, is really to discern not only what he sees and hears in this moment, but even what our neighbors are communicating. We, the people, collectively spoke yesterday. And as much as I think what was said reflects deep division and an inner turmoil and conflict. What's really being said, I think, requires us to get beyond some of the noise and the rancor and the rhetoric, dial that down a little bit and really listen.
Yeah, I'd say for me, I've committed to knowing and believing that your object of hope has to be greater than your object of fear. And so when you put your hope in the right place, there is peace and courage, and we can move out of that, understanding where our hope really lies. And then also committing to the idea that light shines brightest in the darkness. And I just think this gives us an opportunity to really show people what we believe and who our hope is. And so I see it as an opportunity to do something great.
I look at it as I wake up this morning and not that I want to dismiss any of the hurts and feelings that people have, but my commission hasn't changed whatsoever. And kind of going on with what Cesar said and what Jeremy said. And I'm at my kid's school right now. I just got done with parent-teacher conference, and they were gracious enough to open up this room so I can be on this. And they said something about my son. She's like, your son has the ability to really influence and change this class, and he's so creative. And I'm going, that's my hope, is that we right here collective are pouring into students who have the best and most captive audience in this nation. And so my hope is really in that gospel transformation of their lives so they can see the gospel transform America. So my hope and my commission has not changed whatsoever yesterday or tomorrow. Today, it's a great commission lived out.
I've been really following the election closely and interacting with a lot of different people, friends who are very, very kind of left wing or very, very right wing. And I've just seen so much fear on both sides. And so often the object of the fear is the temporal. It's based in this world. It's based in kind of comfort or ease of life. And just so often, I see people, extreme anxiety. I've seen a lot of people posting suicide prevention hotlines because people are so upset about what's going on in the country. So I've tried to really intentionally over the past few months just put it all in perspective. Even in a global perspective, but also just in a history of the world perspective, where I look at believers who have been through serious hardships and they found their hope in something other than this world. So as I've been trying to renew my mind around that and around kind of where our object of hope lies, it's just been very relieving. And watching the election results last night, I didn't have near the level of anxiety I had earlier on in the election cycle, because I realized more and more that whatever the results are, just like Brian said, it doesn't change our commission or our eternal destinies.
So I intentionally did not watch anything last night. I did a check-in about 9:30. It was a very quick check-in to a couple of the news stations, but on purpose, I watched something on Netflix because what's happened in the past few months, I realized that my anxiety was reaching a whole new level with Facebook feeds and Twitter, just everything. People at the beauty salon and the grocery store and everywhere, so many voices that I knew if I put myself in that place all night last night, I would be in a very different place this morning. And so waking up this morning, of course, the first thing I did was check to see what happened. But surprisingly, so much more peaceful than I thought I would be. Sad, yeah. A bit angry, yeah. Some emotions I can't seem to name right now, but there's still a peace. The other part of it is I spent a lot of last week with some incredible youth leaders from different parts of the country. And so for me, being able to have that peaceful space last night they came to mind this morning. And I thought, what hope lies in the folks who are actually touching the kids on the street and in the schools and in the churches. And so a lot of emotions ranging this morning. I've cried a little bit. I've laughed a little bit. I've done everything. But underneath and on top and in between all of it is this this piece that I cannot explain. And I'm grateful for that. I don't need to know. I don't have to explain it. I'm just glad it's there.
That's powerful. Thanks.
Yeah. That's funny, Akila. You talk about going to the hair salon. That just took me to another place, because y'all don't know about the urban. I mean, when you go to the urban, hair salons and the barber shops, woo, yeah.
Woo-hoo.
I mean, they getting it on there. So I definitely have to be prayed up before I enter into that space at this moment. But I think, even I mentioned this to a few of our staff yesterday or the day before. For some reason, that movie Crash came back to my remembrance, and just as was stated here on this call, this is no surprise to God. It's not like God said, "Dang, I didn't see that coming." I missed that. But I think the conflict and the emotions could be a setup for us to be able to crash into conversations and spaces that we wouldn't have normally been able to have if people remained in their individual lanes. And so I think not just the election, but even all of the activity and events that have taken place, over these past, short few years, is going to give us a better opportunity to, go into relationships and understandings that we might not have had the benefit to have if we would have left things the status quo.
That's great. And so that makes me think about one of the biggest challenges during this election for me has just been reminding myself that there's a story behind every differing perspective, right? There's a story behind every vote. And so how do we empathize and understand the influences in people's lives and the way in which they make decisions differently than we do? And I mean, it's an incredible amount of work. It's an uncomfortable process. It's an emotional labor that is important. And so with students, then how do we encourage students to dig into that discomfort of being able to sit next to people who they disagree with, be able to have civil conversations, to empathize with them in order to bridge people? And Fred, since you mentioned that, I would love if you wouldn't mind sharing from your own perspective, because you have this interesting position of being able to be in daily conversations with youth workers across the U.S. And youth ministry networks across the U.S. And so how are you seeing them do that? And how are you encouraging students in your own community to do that?
Yeah, I think as youth leaders, whether urban or non-urban, people of color or not people of color, I think we have to make sure that we have the discussions at our level, because we're basically that generation that has one foot in the old and one foot in the new. And so what happens is we carry a lot of history from ancestors and parents that, have shared with us in days past, and then maybe even some of the experiences that we have on our own, even as adults, maybe not being able to mix with the right blend that we'd love to see the kingdom have. And so, yes, we need to have those conversations at our level, but we need to take those experiences and not transfer them to the students, but take them as ways to help them learn how to move forward and engage in relationship and conversations and making it look more like the body of Christ. We're the ones that God has given us the opportunity, to be able to create those types of programs, those type of settings, those type of mentors to make sure that they have a better chance of winning than maybe we might have had in the past.
Fred.
I heard my name.
I think we lost Stephanie.
They're hanging on.
I think that we've got a whole lot of students that are going to show up tonight at church, and we've got to be youth workers. I think that we have to make sure that we're not still all of our angst, and that we're their questions. Those of us that get to wait till Sunday till we see them, we've got a few more days to process. But some of us got a whole lot of students coming tonight, and being ready for that, I think, will be important.
I think there's an element of us learning from them just as much as us trying to shepherd them through this. I mean, I know for my students that I get to deal with, they're already in such a diverse place, way more diverse than my circles that I run in. And so I want to be asking them questions. What was this like at school today for you? What are you guys having to process through, and know what questions they're asking by us asking the questions. So I want to learn from them.
And I think part of our responsibility too is to model what it means to get beyond some of the surface emotion, right? So there's been, within the context of this election and a lot of other elections, there's the tendency to oversimplify and demonize the opponent, and to buy into these really stark either-or statements, not only about how we perceive things, but judgments about how other people perceive things. So I think part of our task as those conversations unfold is to empower people to hear the complexity of the views. I think it was Duffy earlier, somebody used the word odious to describe the choice that people had to make. And so for some of us, the misogyny and the bigotry of the rhetoric was the dominant consideration. For other people, that was a consideration, but an equally important one for them was the perceived corruption and kind of Teflon culture of the status quo. And so just as two starting points, right? And so to be able to actually listen and recognize and restore the humanity of people who see it differently than we do, and who made a different choice than we do, but to respect not only their right to make that choice, but the fact that for a lot of them it was a difficult one to make. And if we're going to move forward as bridge builders, we can't necessarily hold that choice against them.
Yeah, I think that's well put. I'll just say real quick, Ash, that I think what you said, Jeremy, really nails it. I mean, it's really easy to assume that people vote the way they vote because they are this or because they are that. And of course, the internet was filled with that kind of accusation. And I think that all of us have brothers and sisters that we love and know really well, with whom we have different political views. And I know these people. I know their motives. I mean, as much as I think I know their motives about any choices they make. And so I think your admonition to think more deeply, listen more carefully, watch for more complexity. That's kind of what we have to model for our students. I mean, I had an 8:30 class this morning, and the first couple of girls that came in were lamenting. One girl said, I said, "How you doing?" And she said, "Well, I'm sort of depressed about the election," and rather than necessarily try to say, well, gee, you should have thought this, you didn't think that, or whatever. Just listen. I know these young women, and they want, they want God's best for this country. And so, so I guess that's the approach that I have to bring to these conversations, but I liked the way you put it.
I think moving forward, we have to be really intentional about creating a culture of diversity of thought with our students. It can be really easy, when we have really strong feelings about an election or a particular theology, to always want to correct a student who believes differently than us. But to allow them to be on their journey and to come alongside them and kind of play the long game rather than trying to correct everything that they say, I think goes a long way in kind of creating that culture where you can begin to empathize. The other thing is students are really mean to each other. And I think we need to be really intentional about disciplining students who won't listen, or correcting students who want to shut everybody up who believes differently than them, so that we can create a culture where everybody isn't afraid to say their thoughts for fear that somebody's going to jump down their throat.
Yeah, I would say it's important that we see ourselves as shepherds, and that means we're shepherds over all the sheep. And where we can feel the feelings, that's important for us to process emotions with our safe people. But when we get in front of students, when we get with their families, to say, no matter how I view this, how I voted, I am still responsible to shepherd. I'm still responsible to be a peacemaker. And for youth pastors to keep their eyes open, whether it's tonight or later this week on Sunday, saying, who are the quiet sheep? Who are the ones that are sitting here that maybe think differently than the rest of the crowd? They're scared, they're angry, they're celebrating and they're rejoicing. And it's like, how do we make sure we're caring for them as well in the mix? And I think that's vital for us.
Yeah, and Jenny, you segued into a question that I was really curious about. And from your perspective, I hope you'll lead us off on the answer to this, but does the role of a youth worker shift or change in political conversations? Does the role of a pastor change when all of a sudden politics and how you vote is brought up? What insights do you have for us in that?
That's a tough call. And oh my goodness, I lean more towards we are shepherds. We are shepherds of all of our people, and we are peacemakers, so we need to figure that out. But I've also been in settings where the pastor is fighting against unjust economic systems, unjust juvenile justice systems in their community, and they have to get involved on a political level to make it happen. And so how do you make sure that you don't be friends with those who hold power, but you know how to use power for the greater good, for God's good? And so that you're not selling your soul for a partnership or a collaboration, but you are staying ethical and above board in that. And so I think it's important that if you're involved politically, that if you walk into that politician's office, they have no idea if you're coming there to encourage them or to fight with them. Because you have your people's best interests at heart. You have God's best interests at heart. So be very careful. Jeremy would be a great person to weigh in on this, because I know you've had to deal with a lot of politicians.
I don't know that the role is necessarily different, but the application of the role changes, right? So the day-to-day reality of a youth worker, I would imagine with very few exceptions, you're dealing with lots of individuals who have different perspectives, different experiences, different family dynamics. They come into our youth groups and our youth ministry settings processing very unique and contextual realities. And part of our job is to create an environment that's safe for them to discover God despite their circumstances. I think that's the same kind of mentality that comes regardless of what the issue is, if it's a cultural conversation, a theological one, or a political one. And being, having the, I guess, maturity to be able to separate our own personal beliefs and our own personal voting preferences from that responsibility for the flock, I think is really important. With that said, I would echo, Ginny's wisdom that there are issues that do require a certain amount of advocacy and mobilization, but even in there, being careful not to demonize the other, the opponent. I think that's part of what differentiates a faith-filled response from a more typical political one, right? We see the humanity even when somebody is postured as our enemy. Figuring out where there's commonality and allowing that to guide the conversation, I think gets us further in a more sustainable way than by simply reinforcing, the dividing lines that usually characterize those arguments.
Yeah, I really, for me personally and professionally, I think this was the biggest, leave aside, how to vote for just a minute. To me, that was a big question. Trying to just wrestle with that theologically. What is my role? As you say, Jenny, I'm a shepherd, and I don't want to allow, my own personal political beliefs, which may be wrong, right? They might be right, they might be wrong, but I don't feel as confident about those as I do about biblical truth that I try to teach. Because that could be wrong too, but I feel more confident about it. And I actually had one incident that was really interesting and really fun, but also instructive. In the church that I'm a teaching pastor at a church down in Houston, Texas, and great people, awesome church. And back in June, I think it was, you guys will remember that Donald Trump met with 1,000 evangelical leaders. Do you remember that there in New York City? And that caused outrage, that they would meet with him. And it just happened that happened actually right in the middle of a 2-week series that I was doing on Zacchaeus. And of course, at the heart of the Zacchaeus narrative is the outrage that Jesus would have an audience with a man who was a sinner. And so I decided in my trying to engage people in my sermon that week that I would draw the parallel between the outrage that these 1,000 evangelical leaders sort of felt when they met with Trump. And I went through I just tried to sort of to think of him as sort of a modern day Zacchaeus story, except that I said, look, I don't know how Trump's story is. That was also, if you remember, that was when some evangelical leaders said, oh yeah, this guy's a Christian, he's born again. One person said, I led him to Christ. There was a lot of talk about that. And I said, look, I don't know anything. Like 3 or 4 times in the sermon, I said, I don't know anything about Donald Trump's faith, but what I really wanted us to consider is that God's grace, that nobody's beyond the reach of God's grace. Zacchaeus isn't or wasn't, and Donald Trump isn't or wasn't, and Duffy Robbins isn't or wasn't, and anyway, by and large, I thought it went pretty well. But there were 2 emails in response that I got. One said I was too easy on Trump because the guy said, you made it sound like he became that he's definitely a Christian, and how come there's not the fruits of repentance and so forth. And the other person said, you were too hard on Trump because you said he he was like Zacchaeus, and that people thought he gotten his money from dishonest means and so forth. And but anyway, in the middle of all that, it made me kind of rethink, because Trump was such a polarizing figure. I mean, they both were, but it just like, it was such a polarizing name. Should I have even mentioned his name in my sermon? And all I was trying to do was to sort of get people into the narrative, and I made it clear I'm not trying to say this guy's, he's a modern day Zacchaeus or anything. I just was trying to get, and it did get their attention. But then I go, man, maybe I couldn't even mention this guy. It's too polarizing. But then I was kind of going, well, but why can't I mention it? Why can't I use that? And said, what is my role as a shepherd? What are the limits of what I want to say? And I think all of us reckon with that when you see stuff on Facebook or Twitter. And probably like the rest of you, I exercise, whether my followers believe it or not, I exercise a lot of restraint. I try not to be too partisan, because that's not my main agenda. But then I think about guys like William Wilberforce and Martin Luther King and Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and go, well, those guys didn't back off. And so to me, that question was a really professionally, theologically, I still want to talk about that with people. I still want to kind of figure that out. That's a big question for me this election. Sorry to take so long. I'll sign off.
Oh, it's okay. So sorry, you were about to say something.
Can I weigh in on the shepherding thing? I think we need to lead people to examine themselves and mind their words. And the Christmas story, the context is Mary and Joseph had a messy situation, and on the way to quietly divorce, the angel of the Lord said, name him Jesus, because he's going to save people from their sins. Joseph is hoping that the Savior will save them from the situation. And it's kind of a good news, because the Savior's coming, but he's coming to examine ourselves. And he's not coming to save us from the situation. He's coming so that we examine exactly our situation within us, not around us. Even in the context, God's people were being oppressed by the Romans. And he didn't say, I'm going to save you from your situation. I'm going to save you from yourselves. And so I think we just need to lead people into examining where they're thinking or how they're thinking, and teach people how to think, not what to think, and lead them to not answers, but authenticity.
I love that. So I'm going to put you on the spot a little bit. What are some practical examples? Like, how do we move students' passion and concern into action, especially in situations where maybe they have family or parents that are overly concerned about the election outcomes, maybe even more so than they are. So how do we equip them? How do we prepare them to be a part of positive change? What's a practical example maybe that you might?
One thing is to help them create a healthy understanding of discomfort. So asking difficult questions. The greatest growth never came out of the greatest comfort, and we try to avoid conversations that are going to be uncomfortable. So just giving kids the freedom to say, this is when I felt the most uncomfortable. This is when I saw this, I felt like this, and then help them unpack that. Where is that coming from? And so just leading people into uncomfortable conversations, I think, is a very healthy thing that will lead to growth.
So Fred, don't laugh, but I grew up in Dayton, Ohio. And you see there what happens. When I was in high school, Dayton went through a very serious situation, kind of what's happening now. There was a lot of violence in the city. And I remember being like 13 or 14 years old and terrified, just scared of what was going to happen every day. There were people being like carjacked on the street and shot on the corner, and just craziness happening. I remember the pastor of my church, who was a young guy at the time, brought about 20 kids into a room with an easel and a marker. And he said, so what are you going to do about it? we had cried and we complained, and our parents were afraid. And do we move at it? What do we do? What do we do? Do I move them to a different school, to a different part of the city? But the pastor was so incredible. Kicked all the parents out of the room, had a group of teenagers, and said, so what are you going to do about it? And I remember thinking to myself, this man is insane. If he thinks that a group of teenagers can actually do anything, nobody's going to listen to us. Nothing's going to happen. We never had a pastor to ask us, what are you going to do? And he said, nothing in this city is going to change until you do it. If you want the schools to change, if you want the city to change, then you have to do it. And I, again, thought, yeah, we're going to have to get a new pastor really soon, because clearly this man has lost his mind. But the end result of that was at least 6 years of a student movement at that church that led me to this place. I came into ministry because a pastor stood with an easel and a marker and said, what are you going to do about it? And it was the first time anybody had asked the kids, what are you going to do? They always wanted to hear what we wanted, and they would, oh, that's good, that's very sweet. But no one had ever asked us, what are you going to do? And we will back you up and support it. And so I think I'm more nervous for Sunday morning than I was for this morning, because this is a defining moment for our churches and for our youth pastors and for people of faith. Are we going to go to our kids and say, well, just comfort them a little bit, but are we going to straight up ask them, so what are you going to do, without giving them the answer, without kind of telling them how they should feel or telling them what they should do? Are we courageous enough to open the door and say, so what are you going to do? And then courageous enough to back them up and support them. I think this is our defining moment right now.
Yeah, that's good, Akila. I think, helping students to be able to share what's important to them and what changes they want to see. And I think that coincides with even Hillary Clinton's concession speech today. I found it interesting that she was basically saying, you got to stay true to the cause and stay towards the mission. So much so that she even quoted Galatians 6:9. She said, hey, remember, we can't get weary in well-doing and doing good, for in due season, you reap. And so I think not that we have to throw a bunch of scripture at students, but I think that we certainly, one, need to make sure that they have practical buy-in. And two, you've got to make sure that we at least give them one scripture that they can highlight, because at the end of the day, even our best form of communication won't last like scripture will, on the inside. And so I appreciate that.
I think,
go ahead.
I was just going to say, regardless of what side people voted, if they voted for Trump and the idea of making America great again, or they voted against Trump because of, the rhetoric and the misogyny and all the rest, and in either extreme, the responsibility ultimately doesn't reside with the White House to make our neighborhoods better again. It resides with us, learning how to love our neighbors as ourselves, learning how to press in beyond the surface and the circumstances. And I think that is where the action derives from, right? So having the courage, like Akila's youth worker did, to listen and then support and invest and back and go to bat for our kids and our communities, as each one of us has a responsibility, regardless of how we voted, to love our neighbors as ourselves and to embody the gospel and demonstrate it in how we live, and in the issues that we fight for and that we build towards. I think that that's ultimately our responsibility and our opportunity as we activate our kids to help lead the charge.
That's so great. So, Jeremy, that's a great segue into some final words of encouragement. We've got about 1 minute left before we'll say goodbye. Does anyone want to offer a couple of final words to a youth worker who's waking up trying to scratch their head and catch their breath and figure out on Sunday morning? I think I think we can all use a little bit of that reminder. Anyone want to leave us with something?
Stay the course. That's all I'll say.
Yeah. I would also just encourage everybody to realize they don't need to have all the answers. You know, as you walk into your youth group tonight, don't expect to walk out with everything solved. Just go in humbly and listen and point kids towards Jesus like you always do, and let him control kind of the direction.
Awesome. Well, thanks everyone for joining us today. It means the world to be a part of a tribe that has the potential and desire to bridge some pretty incredible divides in our country, all for the sake of the gospel. So for those of you watching, if you're joining us at the National Youth Workers Convention, we'll see you in Cincinnati next week, November 17th through the 20th. If you haven't registered yet, do it today so that you don't miss this powerful time together with youth workers from all across the U.S. And for those of you sitting in our virtual room, it really is incredible being able to lean into your wisdom, your experience, and honestly just your grace in a time that doesn't quite feel like there's enough of it in this world. So thank you for that. And for the rest of you watching, if you have any questions, reach out to us on social. Shoot us a quick comment on the video on the YouTube page, or shoot us an email at ys@youthspecialties.com. We're here for you. We're in your corner, and we're doing this thing together.
Thank you. Great to see you.